And we'd like to welcome those who are visiting. We do have some visitors in our presence, and we're certainly glad to have you. Before we get into our study, I want to update some of our folks. Continue to remember Peggy McGowan, Bill's sister, if you will. He saw her yesterday, and some days are better than others, but certainly want to continue to remember her. Also, Kathy Taylor is still in the Baptist DeSoto Hospital rehab, along with Doris Green and Jeannie Hudson. They're all right there, and their rooms are close together. And so I want to remember all of them as they continue their rehab. They're making progress, but they will be there. I don't know exactly how long. No, they are hoping and anticipating Kathy being able to come home Friday, but they're not sure about that either. Certainly want to remember all of these others who we have many who are sick, suffering with various situations. Good to see George and Carolyn with us tonight, and want to continue to remember them and her sister Sheila particularly. Anyone I'm not aware of or we need to update, let me know. We want to mention if you'd like. Okay. As we begin our class, we'll do so with prayer as always. Brother Dale, would you lead us in prayer to start our class, please?
Our most holy Heavenly Father, as we come to Thee tonight, we give thanks for this day and all blessings Thou hast given unto us, and especially for the opportunity to come to study Thy Word tonight. Be with Brother Bill as he brings Thy lesson unto us, that we may retain it and we'll live as Thou would have us to do while we are upon this earth. Be with all that are sick and afflicted, ones that were mentioned tonight, and be with them, care for them, and comfort them, and bring them back to that much wanted health, if it be Thy will. And Heavenly Father, be with us as we go on through the furtherance of this life. Forgive us of the things we've committed against Thee, and help us all that we may have the strength to overcome the temptation of sin, and live as Thou would have us to while we are on this earth. For these and all blessings we ask Thy Son. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Well, Mike is, as you know, continuing the meeting over in Highway 77, West Memphis. And so tonight I'll fill in his absence. And we're in chapter 26 of Matthew. And if you will, go with me over there. And let's remind ourselves a little bit of what's going on. Of course, Jesus now has been praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and his disciples are nearby, and there's three in particular he has taken with him. Do you recall who those three are? All right, Peter, James, and John. And as he's prayed now, I don't remember exactly what verse we got to or Mike left off, but tonight I want us to focus primarily on verse 51. Matthew 26 and verse 51. They came and laid hands on Jesus in verse 50 and took him. And then we read, behold, one of them which were with Jesus stretched out his hand, drew his sword, and struck a servant of the high priest, and smote or cut off his ear. Now, that's all Matthew tells us about that, isn't it? Well, let's turn over to Mark and read the Mark account. Chapter 14. In Mark 14, go with me down to verse 46. They laid their hands on him and took him. And one of them that stood by drew a sword and smote or cut a servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Basically the same thing Matthew said, wasn't it? One of these with Jesus cuts off a man's ear. Well, turn on over now. Let's go to Luke's account. In Luke chapter 22. And look with me, if you will. Begin with me at verse 49. Luke 22, verse 49. When they which were about him saw what would follow, they said to him, Lord, shall we smite or fight with a sword? So now in Luke's account, we read where he's asked the question, shall we defend you or fight for you with sword? And then in verse 50, one of them smote the servant of the high priest. We learn a little more about who this individual is, don't we? He's a servant of the high priest. And cut off what? Right ear. So now we know which ear was cut off, don't we? Luke, what is his profession? He's a physician, a doctor, isn't he? So it's not at all uncommon for Luke to give us more information from the physical standpoint, isn't it? So he's got his right ear cut off. We learn he's a servant of the high priest also. Then, let's go. Well, no, while we're in verse 51, Jesus, we now know his right ear has been cut off. And then in verse 51, we read, Jesus answered and said, suffer or allow thus far, and he touched his ear and healed him. So now we know his right ear was cut off. He's a servant of the high priest, and Jesus touches his ear, and he's healed, or touches him. Yeah.
He took a piece of ear that was cut off and put back, or he just touched his ear and healed him?
Says it touched his ear.
Okay, didn't say anything about the piece.
Doesn't say he picked it up off the ground. He touched his ear. Now, we're going to pursue this further, but before we do, let's go to John's account. Turn on over with me, if you will, to John's account, chapter 18 of John. John 18. And look with me at verse 10. Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it. So now what do we learn immediately? We know which one did the cutting, don't we? Peter, having a sword, drew it, smote the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. So John tells us the same thing, doesn't he? It's his right ear, but we also learn who did it. Simon Peter. And we also learn something else. What's the man's name that had the ear cut off? Malchus. So now we've learned more, haven't we? Malchus has had his ear cut off. Who did it? Peter did. What did he use? A sword. But notice verse 11 in John's account. Jesus speaks to Peter in verse 11, and he says, put up your sword to the sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? So Jesus tells him to put away his sword. He doesn't tell us, in John's account, though, what happens that he heals. So go with me now back to Luke's account, if you will. In Luke chapter 22, and notice with me there, one of them that smote the servant of the high priest cut off his right ear. Well, we know who that one is now. Peter cut off Malchus's right ear with a sword. Now, knowing that his right ear has been cut off, What does it look like now? Up here where his ear was. Hmm?
Nothing had happened.
I still didn't hear you.
It's like nothing had happened.
Well, wouldn't you think it was bloody? If somebody whacks your ear off, what's going to be the result?
You're gonna bleed profusely.
Yeah,
You're gonna have a lot of blood coming out of your head there.
I guarantee you. Now, don't go try it just to find out. But I suspect all of us have, at some time or other, had something to cause our ear to bleed, hadn't we? So Malchus is standing here with his ear severed, blood flowing. And what does Jesus do? He doesn't say call 911, does he? Because more than 911 was there, wasn't he? And we read Jesus touches. And what's the result? Healing. When? Didn't take 2 or 3 days or immediately. What has transpired now? That's right, a miracle, hasn't it? Who's present when this is going on? What's the scene? All right. A whole band with Judas, when sticks, they've come to take him as a criminal, haven't they? What time is it? Yeah. Before daylight, early in the day, isn't it? Before dark. So they've got, no doubt, torches to see by. And also, I've read, by being the Passover, there was a full moon. So they had some light. Now, was Peter that good a shot? Or did he intend to hit his head and he missed? He wasn't good a shot. I don't know. Could have it. I don't know. All I know is what I read. Did this happen? Yes. Did Jesus touch and heal? Yes. Now, is the ear an important part of our body? What's the primary function of the ear? You can't hear without the ear, can you? Now, some of you have to have some assistance hearing, don't you? I didn't call your name, Trent, yet. But more than, in addition to, and probably as important, any of you had vertigo, John? Infections, various things? Yeah. What does it cause you to do? Dizzy? It's very important about your balance, isn't it? Yes. The ear has more functions than just hearing, although that's what we immediately think of. I don't know too much about the ear, other than what little I read and have seen pictures of it, but there's at least 3 little bones in there. I don't remember all of them. Maybe you do. One of them's a stirrup. The only stirrup I'm really familiar with is on a saddle, getting on a horse. But anyway, they're there.
Your ear is made out of
Cartilage, yep.
It won't grow back.
Well, I've read where it keeps on growing the older you get, especially with men, they get bigger.
I've had operations on my ear before, and my doctor says it's cartilage.
Yeah, it's cartilage.
I had
Yeah.
to take it off, and it did grow back.
Well, yeah, that's what I've read and heard. I don't know if they get as big as an elephant, if you live that long or not, but the point is, Malchus lost his ear, didn't he? Why did Peter whack off his ear? Is this the same Peter that says, I will die with you, Lord? Is this the same Peter back in chapter 16 that confessed, "Thou art the Christ, as the Son of the living God"? And then turned around and said, "No, we're not going to let this happen to you, Lord," and everything. And Jesus said, "Get behind me," who? Satan. It's the same man, isn't it? Yeah. And now on this occasion, this mob has come to take him by force. Is Jesus resisting? Is he putting up a fight? No. None of that is he. But Peter takes his and whack. Malchus lost his ear. And then we read Jesus touches and heals. Who's observing all of this?
All the people that are there.
All that mob, aren't they? Performs a miracle as they're taking him by force, right in front of them. Mm-hmm. Well, that word touch is interesting, isn't it? If you will, notice a couple of places I want us to turn to. Turn back to Matthew chapter 8, some more familiar verses that you're aware of. But Jesus touched people. Now, sometimes we use that word in various ways, don't we? We use it as actual feeling with our hands and touching someone or something. We also use it in the sense of being touched by words, don't we not? On the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, we read that they were pricked in their heart. Well, what pricked them? What cut them? What touched them? The Word, the gospel. Peter, this man who cut Malchus's ear off, now cuts them with the truth, doesn't he? In Acts chapter 2, does he not? So touch can mean various things. What determines is, of course, the context that is used in. Now, if you will, go back to Matthew 8, as I mentioned a moment ago, and let's begin reading let's just start at verse 1. When he was come down from the mountain, speaking of Jesus, great multitudes followed him. Behold, there came a leper and worshipped him, saying, "Lord, if you will, you can make me clean." So what is this man who comes and worships Jesus? What's his condition? Oh, he's a leper, isn't he? A dreaded disease, is it not? And Jesus put forth his hand and did what? He touched him, saying, "I will be clean." Immediately, what happens? He's healed, isn't he? Just like Malchus's ear is back.
Billy, is leprosy still an active disease in the world?
Yes, as a matter of fact, the Goodhams, just recently, that was Ronnie, wasn't it? I get them mixed up.
It's a congregation, the leprosy congregation in Kakinada.
In Kakinada, India, where we help support.
Now, is there any treatment or cure for it now?
As far as cure, I don't
They
think.
told me they wasn't contagious, but I made sure I didn't touch it.
Well, in this day, and they're most likely, and what little I know about, there's different forms or kinds also. And in their day and time, what we're talking about here, in fact, it was, and they were to be out, stay away. In fact, cry out, "Leper, leper," and not touch. And if you did, in fact, touch on the Mosaic law, you were what? Unclean. But Jesus did what? He touched him. Well, notice this. Immediately his leprosy was cleansed in verse 3. Jesus says, "See, you tell no man, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded for a testimony unto them." Well, this is a reference, of course, back to Leviticus 14. Go to the priest and offer, you see, because of his cleansing, you see.
One other question.
Yes, sir?
I'm sure there's a reason that Jesus told him not to tell anybody, but
Yeah.
why?
Is it because you just get swarmed with people? What was the reason for that?
Well, first place, Jesus knew what he was doing, and he was on God's timeline, wasn't he? Now, multitudes followed him, and at times it did inhibit him, no doubt. But he also did not want to be deterred from his purpose on God's timeline. But of course, they did anyway. But here he touched him, and he's healed. He touched Malchus, and he's healed. Now, I want us to look at another one or two. Go to Mark. Let's look at Mark 1, chapter 1 and verse 41. Jesus moved with compassion. Now, moved with compassion. Can you say, would it be accurate to say Jesus is touched? He's moved, isn't he? Because in verse 40, there came a leper to him, beseeching him, kneeling down to him, saying, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus, moved with compassion, put forth his hand and touched him and said, I will be clean. And as soon as he had spoken, immediately the leprosy departed from him, and he was cleansed. In Mark's account, we see compassion, don't we? Well, in Matthew's account also, but it's more expressed here. Jesus was touched by people, wasn't he? He was touched in the sense of he was moved with compassion, wasn't he? And he touches and heals. Now, go with me again to Luke chapter 7 for a moment. Now, we've read these two or three occasions where he is healed. But now look in let's go to chapter 7 of Luke and look about verse 14. Let's start reading in verse 11. Luke 7 and verse 11. It came to pass that he went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him, and much people. Now when he came near to the gate of the city, behold, there was a dead man carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And much people of the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said, now as he moved with compassion again, his love and care and concern, he says, weep not. And he came and touched the coffin.
Not the person.
No. He just touched the coffin in this case, didn't he? That bare him, he came and touched the coffin, and they that bare him stood still. And he said, young man, I say to you, arise. He's moved with compassion. This lady has lost her son. He says, young man, arise. In verse 15, he that was dead sat up and began to speak, and he delivered him to his mother. Did Jesus raise the dead? Miracles, and we could look at many others, but these, I'm just pointing these out for us to show, again, Jesus touch or speaks. He doesn't even have to be there, does he? But we see him on these various occasions. Now, if you will, let's go back to Luke's account in Luke chapter 22, where we read that Jesus touched him. And he's healed. Luke 22 and verse 50 and 51. We now know Peter is the one who cuts off his right ear of Malchus. And Jesus says, or we read rather, he touched his ear and healed him. Now, Jesus has just performed a miracle right before these people's eyes, hasn't he? Malchus is the recipient of the miracle. Now, if you will, read on with me, continuing at verse 52. Then Jesus said unto the chief priests and captains of the temple and the elders which were come to him. We're still out here where the mob is taking him. Gotcha. You can't, but you be. Let me start over, verse 52. Then Jesus said unto the chief priests and captains of the temple and the elders which were come to him, be you come out as against a thief with swords and staves? When I was daily with you in the temple, you stretched forth no hands against me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. Then they took him and led him and brought him into the high priest's house. And Peter does what? All right, at a distance. When they had kindled a fire in the midst of the hall and were sat down together, Peter sat down among them. But a certain maid beheld him as he sat by the fire, earnestly looked upon him, and said, this man was also with him. And he denied him, saying, woman, I don't know him. After a little while, another saw him and said, you are also one of them. And Peter said, man, I am not. So first we have a woman that says, and he denies. Then we have a man that says he was. And about the space of an hour later, another confidently affirmed, saying, of a truth this fellow also was with him, for he's a Galilean. And we also read that his speech, he said, betrayed him. Peter said, man, I know not what you're saying. Immediately, while he spake, what happens? The rooster crowed. Had Jesus told him what was going to happen? He did. And it did.
Did it say anything else about the other apostles? We assume that they deserted him too.
Yes. In fact, we're going to read that accordingly too. Let's go to John's account again. Let's go to John 18. We learn various more information by each of the records that we have, and this is true in many cases, that one writer gives us more information on matters, and this was a case here. So going over to John's account, we've read already that Peter cut off Malchus's ear back in verse 10, and Jesus tells him to put up his sword. Now, go with me, let's look over, go down to verse 15. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then went out that other disciple which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. So now Peter goes in. Then says this young lady that kept the door to Peter, are you not also one of this man's disciples? What does Peter say? I'm not, no. And the servants and officers stood there, who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. The high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. Jesus answers, I spake openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogue, in the temple, whether Jews always gather, and in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask them which heard me what I said unto them. Behold, they know what I said. And when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Do you answer the high priest in such a manner? In other words, Jesus said, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? Had Jesus spoken the truth on every occasion? Did he have any reason to be arrested, to be struck for what's happening now to him? No. And he says, you ask the ones in the synagogues. I have nothing to hide. Now Annas had sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest, in verse 24. Now, verse 25. Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. They said therefore unto him, Are not you one of his disciples? And what does Peter say? No, I'm not. Verse 26, one of the servants of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, said, Did I not see you in the garden with him? So now what do we see? What do we learn? A kinsman or a relative of Malchus was there too, and now is here. And he says, weren't you the one that cut off Malchus's ear, in other words? Now what does he do? Peter denied again, and immediately what happens? The rooster crows again. Now, here is the beginning, going into a false trial of Jesus. Everything about it is unlawful. Where is Malchus now? Sir? Malchus? You think about the rich man.
Well, he's there too because he's long and dead.
No, Malchus not. This just happened a few hours ago. He had his ear whacked off. Oh, now. Then now. Okay. I got you. All right. On the scene at the present, where we are. Yeah. Malchus is not there, is he?
He may or may not be an Abraham.
Well, no. The point is this. Malchus had his ear whacked off, didn't he? But he's healed, isn't he? Jesus performs a miracle right there and then. They sure don't want Malchus to be standing here now, because he's living, walking what? Proof of a miracle, isn't he? Now, what if his ear was laying on the ground and he's still bloody and bleeding? Would they wanted him there as Exhibit A? Well, sure. But he's not there because he's living proof. You remember in Jared's sermon the other night, and I had him run that a copy off for me of what Richard Dawkins said. I had read it, I heard it before, but I didn't have a copy of it. In 2012, was that 7 years ago? Renowned atheist Richard Dawkins was questioned about his unbelief in God. He was specifically asked, what proof, by the way, would change your mind? He quickly responded by saying, that is a very difficult and interesting question. Now notice, what would change your mind, Mr. Dawkins? That's a very difficult and interesting question. Because, I used to think that if somehow, a great, big, giant, 900-foot high Jesus with a voice like Paul Robeson suddenly strode in and said, I exist and here I am. But even that, I actually sometimes wonder if that would. Does that sound like what we're reading here? Here's the evidence. Were there people present when Jesus performed miracles who denied still that he's the Son of God? Over and over again, didn't they?
Instead of believing him, they started planning to try to kill him.
Yeah. Here we have a case, probably this is somewhere around 3 o'clock in the morning or so, and Peter has whacked off this man's ear. No doubt he's bleeding just like you or I would be if somebody's cut our ear off. Jesus touches it, and it's immediately healed. Now, we're in that multitude there observing this. Would that make any difference with us? It should.
Especially the person who had his ear cut off.
Yeah. And here we are just a short time later, maybe 2 or 3 hours at the most. Why didn't they bring Malchus in this hearing? Because he was proof of the truth, isn't he? And did they want the truth? Were they searching for truth? What is the reason for trial, a court hearing? What is supposed to be the reason for it? To find the truth, isn't it? Is that always done? And in fact, are lies often introduced as truth? But they're not. No, if a person decides, I don't care what the truth is, I don't care what the facts are, I'm going to believe what I want to believe regardless. Is that an honest mind? Is he being honest? You remember back in Genesis 18 and verse 14, God tells Abraham and Sarah they're going to have what? A child. What does Sarah do? At verse 14, Jehovah says, is anything too hard for the Lord, for me? What did he make Adam out of? What did he make Eve out of? Is that too hard for the Lord? What could he do for a 75-year-old woman? Well, actually, she's going to be older than that. And Abraham's going to be right at 100. Did she give birth to Isaac? Like he said. Who put these ears on us? Is it natural for us to have the body made as we are? With eyes, ears, hands, and all that we're composed of. Is that natural? Well, who started nature? You know, sometimes people say, talk about Mother Nature. No, there's no such thing as a Mother Nature, no more than there is a Mother Goose fairy tale. Nature, who created nature? God did. When God said, let there be light, was there light? When he made from dust Adam, from the rib of Adam, Eve, all of these things were done miraculously to begin with, weren't they? But what about Cain and Abel and all the other children born? Natural, weren't they? nature. God established it. He established laws of procreation, biology, anatomy, all that we are, and all that exists from God. Yes, it would be great. Well, people speculate. I know they were mature. I know they had ears because God spoke to them, didn't they? And said, you tend the garden and you eat from what? Every tree except what? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Did they understand? There's language, isn't it? Yeah.
They were created full grown.
Right. They were mature. Yeah. They were just like God did. Morning and evening, the first day, right on through till they were created on the sixth day. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. And I think we can see it if we stop and look at things. Have you ever just had a superficial cut? Scrape it. All right. Matter of fact, I'll use this because this really happened. There it is, right there. There's the evidence. Sunday morning, 2 weeks ago Sunday, coming up. I went out that door over there, and I get my hand out of the way in time, and it hit my hand and cut it, just on the surface, the skin. What happened? Blood came flowing out. Is that normal? Is that natural? Yes. I took my handkerchief and slapped on it because I had my Bible and some other things in my hand. I didn't want to get blood everywhere. Well, guess what happened after a little bit of time? It quit bleeding, didn't it? Such a thing is called clotting, isn't it? And these things, if you start reading some of these, for instance, Apologetics Press, Christian Courier, the Jacksons and some of these, it will amaze you because they have done so much research, and some of them have their doctorate and what all, and they can give you scientific things that I only read about. But does it scab over? Yeah. I didn't put any medicine on it. You ever done that? Just had some little old superficial thing and went on about your business, didn't you? It bled, it quit bleeding, and it scabbed over, and guess what happened? It healed up, didn't it? You might have had a little old scar left at the most, right? Why? Because God created this body with the capability of doing such, didn't it? Now, does medicine help? Can man do things to enhance or help healing? But are there other things that we will not be healed of? Doctors come in every day and say, don't they, we've done all that we can do. Isn't that the case? We're all going to live until we die. After that, what? The judgment. What are we supposed to be doing now and then, in that period of time then? Being ready. That's right. Being prepared. Reading, studying, building our faith, and trying to teach others. Help them. When Richard Dawkins said if a 900 foot, and he's being sarcastic, Jesus walked in. A multitude of people there, and on many occasions, there were probably more than 900 together on several occasions, weren't there? And he performed miracles. I wonder if Mr. Dawkins had been there and then, would he have believed? Many others wouldn't. We even read where some believed, but yet they wouldn't confess, would they? Because they loved the praise of what? Men rather than the praise of God. They was afraid they'd be put out of the synagogue, lose their status. Yeah. Has anything changed? No. Human nature has not changed, has it? God knew that when he created Adam and Eve. What's the cure for all unbelief?
Get in
Here it is, isn't it? Here it is, right? Without faith, it is impossible to please whom? God. Hebrews 11:6. Because he says, we must believe that he is, and he is a rewarder of them that do what? Seek him diligently, yes. And that's a fact. He rewards those who seek him. If we desire to learn the truth, we can know it, can't we? Well, was that the last bell? I heard that. Yeah. Well, thank you for your interest, your participation so very, very much.
Hi, Mike Hickson here. Thank you so much for watching our worship service today. We're so glad that you took time out of your schedule to be a part of our service today. We'd love to invite you to come and be a part of our worship services every Sunday. We'd love to have you on Wednesday night as well. If you have a question or a comment, please feel free to contact us. Hope to see you right back here again next week. Until then, God bless.